I'm Oswald Iten, and I'm going to take you on a trip to the Philippines, to the southern island of Mindanao. I'm explaining you in this video about the Tasaday. They were Stone Age cave-dwelling people in the Philippines in 1971 discovered. And I'm explaining you why this story was a hoax, completely fabricated by a minister of the Marcos government. The original trip that I did was in 1986. It was still a year of President Marcos being a dictator, ruling with martial law, and the people were poor, like these people here in Manila living on Smoky Mountain, garbage bag. But large part of the Philippines was involved in a civil war, like in Mindanao, the New People's Army controlled part of that big island. In the north, there was Father Conrado Balweg. He's a Catholic priest, and he was the commander of the communist New People's Army. You had the army fighting all these uprising factions. You had militias like the Ilaga in Mindanao, like this man who was feeling bulletproof. He was involved in political murder. You had groups like these cannibals in Negros Island. They were used by the army to frighten opponents of the government. They were even cutting out the liver of their victims and eating them. So they also felt that made them bulletproof. You had in Mindanao different contradicting Muslim insurgents, like this commander of the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. And finally, the day came in 1986 when the Marcos government was toppled. I was there in the first minute to document the fall of Marcos, but also then I went to the south, to Mindanao, to find out what was the truth of the story behind the Tasaday. In 1971, a small group of forest dwellers were discovered, and they were said to be 24 people having no knowledge of other people living on the planet. They were only using food gathering as their subsistence. They had not even fishing, and they didn't hunt. They were just sitting in a cave and being quite well off. So these people were discovered by the Minister for National Minorities, Mr. Manuel Elizalde. And he flew mainly journalists, reporters, and some very few scientists to this isolated place in Mindanao. It was very impressive to be invited to such an expedition, because you were flown on a platform in the jungle where you would be allowed to visit the caves for a few hours during 1 or 2 or 3 days. So the National Geographic was running an extensive sensationalist story about these Stone Age people. They were using these stone axes. When any outsider tried to use this stone axe, they were smashed by immediately. Couldn't be used, actually. There was also a book published by John Nance. He was the bureau chief of the Associated Press in Manila, and he accompanied the Tasaday during their 3 years of on and off exposure to journalists mainly. So I thought it was a great thing by Ferdinand Marcos that he declared in 1974 the Tasaday area as a reservation. You would not be allowed to enter that, they should be protected. I thought this would be one of the best things that Marcos actually did. But when I read everything which was ever published by the articles or the book of John Nance, I found so many contradictions that I found it defendable to break that reservation law and enter illegally. But since Marcos was already gone, the law of banning anybody entering this reservation was also no longer observed. I contacted a priest in Mindanao that he was telling me he knew some of the former Tasaday. They came to the market on Sundays, and he organized a column of porters carrying supplies for us to bring me to the caves. I thought it would be a long walk of maybe several weeks because nobody has ever walked to the caves. They were all flown by helicopter. And I was completely surprised that after one day of walking, we reached the Tasaday place. The first man I encountered, I immediately recognized being a very famous former Tasaday. His name is Bilangan. He was living in a nipa hut, a hut like anybody else was using in the area, anybody else of the Manobo and Tiboli tribe. So he was willing to take me from his hut to the caves, and he presented me with other former prominent Tasaday. First of all, his three sons, Lobo, Lolo, and Natek. And they were actually, for the first time, looking at publications about them from the 70s. They were laughing at pictures like this one, Lobo, looking at a photograph of him that was taken by John Nance. The next morning, we had a stroll to the caves. We followed a little riverbed, and then we had to cut out the path to the caves. The cave was completely unused. You could see there was nothing happened there since 1974. Our party being quite some people number in the meantime, neighbors joining us. They were laughing and telling us how they were instructed by Minister Elizalde how they would have to act, sit in the caves. That was actually what they had to do. And they staged again the same photographs in the same position as they have done 12 years earlier. Then I published my findings in the Neue Zürcher Zeitung under the title The Tasaday, a Philippine Stone Age Swindle. But to my surprise, I learned that another team of journalists had the same suspicions that the Tasaday were a hoax. It was the Stern magazine from Germany. They sent a team of journalists and photographers to Mindanao a week after I have been there. Now, they found the Tasaday in almost the same grouping as I did, but completely in another staging. This time, the Tasaday wore banana leaves and as an invention even banana brassieres. And they were never sleeping in the caves when the Stern people were there. They disappeared in the evening, and when asked where did they go, they said they were going hunting at night. Imagine going hunting at night in the jungle in that Stone Age outfit, no torchlights, nothing. So when the Stern also observed that under these banana leaves, most people were wearing underwear, colored underwear, some of them. So when the reporter said, come on, you can stop this mockery, tell us how it really was. Soon after, there was bandits coming and taking these German reporters as hostage. And they were going through a very rough time. Stern had to pay a ransom. But the publication afterwards, combined with my publication, was very interesting. It showed, for example, on a double page of Stern magazine, on the left side, you would see the prominent former Tasaday Gintui standing with his two wives and the kid. And as I found him on the first day wearing shabby clothes just like anybody else of the Manubo in that area. On the right side, you see Gintui 1 week later, after me, posing back. Now, the explanation that Stern had was that they went to the caves with one of the former organizers of the set-up as Stone Age people, and he had organized the former Tasaday to pose again, so in order to disguise the whole hoax. But of course that didn't go down with the Stern. They were not tricked into it again. But of course some people who were involved in the former original story of the Tasaday were fearing losing, especially people in the academic field like Professor Irenaeus Eibelsfeld, who made some movies in the past. Of course, like some ethnobotanists and linguists, like Professor Carol Moloney, Professor of Linguistics, or Douglas Yen, Professor of Ethnobotany in Hawaii. And also Manuel Elizalde, the former minister. He's an interesting character, very flamboyant, rich man in the Philippines, producer of rum, alcohol, licensee of cold firearms manufacturing, M16 for the army. But in 1983, when he was still a minister, he fled the country, taking millions with him. And later on, he was expelled from Costa Rica for sexual offenses. So he could go back to the Philippines because he was one of the early financial supporters of Cory Aquino's campaign for presidency. So he went back to his huge mansion in the middle of Manila, and he had flown some former Tasaday to Manila, where he presented them again to foreign journalists. There were, for example, some articles in the New York Times. A very respected journalist, correspondent of the New York Times, he wrote, "Cries of Tasaday hoax came too soon," and he relied only on information provided by these pretenders, protagonists of the Stone Age, or authenticity of the Tasaday. And they never contacted me. New York Times didn't feel it necessary to get my opinion. There were some, like Professor Berryman of Berkeley University. He was a he wrote some very strong articles denouncing the hoax. Also, ABC television made a very interesting movie, film about the Tasaday, but other television sets like NBC did again stories defending the authenticity of the Tasaday. Besides the Neue Zürcher Zeitung, also I informed the National Geographic Magazine beforehand of my expedition to the Tasaday about my suspicions that the whole thing might have been a hoax. And they said, yes, they would be very interested. I should submit my material to them should I achieve my goal to go to the caves. So I phoned them after my return and offered them to submit all my material for scrutiny. And to my surprise, the National Geographic sent me immediately a telegram. At that time, there were still telegrams. And it said, we have considered the Tasaday follow-up and decided against pursuing it. So I should not send them my material. Now, this really makes up a big scandal. Not only that they were not interested in my material, but more so, 2 years later in 1988, in their centennial issue of the National Geographic Magazine, they published a full-page photographs of the Tasaday as taken off one of their articles of the 70s, with the caption, "Recent claims of a hoax have been largely discredited." Now this makes it a real scandal, maybe the biggest in the history of the National Geographic. Now that in 1972, the August issue, that they published their original article, that maybe can be explained as National Geographic being tricked into the trap of Elizalde, but that denying any clarification later on, denying any grant application. There were applications for grants by researchers. They're denied by the National Geographic. Now that makes the real scandal, not the first publication. Now, today if you go to the homepage of the National Geographic and type in search for Tasaday, it says 0 results for Tasaday. There were also 3 conferences organized about the Tasaday. One in Manila, one in Zagreb, and the most important in Washington by the American Anthropological Association. Now the organizer of that conference, Professor Headland, he summarized the whole finding of that day-long conference in a book called The Tasaday Controversy, Assessing the Evidence. And he summarized 8 indisputable facts about the Tasaday. Number 1, when discovered, the Tasaday didn't wear loin clothes only, but they were using in their daily life textile clothing. Number 2, the Tasaday stood in trade relations with their neighbors. Number 3, neighboring farmers regularly bought venison from the Tasaday. That means they were also hunters. Number 4, for pure food gatherers, their territory would not have been big enough. In fact, they could have survived only by striving into areas which contained villages and even an asphalted airport. Number 5, no one has ever observed the Tasaday gathering food for a longer period. They were only filmed sitting in the caves, actually. And they were not filmed, but it was a proof that they were sustained by rice delivered by the minister. Number 6, the bamboo used by the Tasaday was not of a wild species but of a cultivated variety. Number 7, the stone axes were made with metal instruments and they were clearly unusable. Number 8, finally, the Tasaday had not a language of their own, but rather a Manobo dialect. For some people, still not the hoax. So the American Anthropological Association decided to set up a committee to investigate the Tasaday case and to declare for once and for all whether it was a hoax or whether the Tasaday could be named still at least an autochthonous, authentic tribe. But unfortunately, up to this present day, more than 20 years later, no finding has been presented to the public. But the most interesting contribution to this so-called controversy was done by Robin Henley. He wrote the book Invented Eden, and his conclusion was that I committed actually the hoax. I was falling into a trap of a translator who invented all the interviews that I did with the Bilangan and all the others. So, but there's still a very interesting book to read because he doesn't dispute the indisputable facts. So he said, yes, there have been aerial photographs by the American Air Force in the 1950s, long before this all happened, that showed near the later caves there was already a village 2.5 miles away. Funny enough, this Tasaday never trapped on this village. And many other things he didn't really go into it. For example, he wouldn't explain why the Tasaday numbering just about 20 people in the 70s would be now 60 people 13 years later. Now this would be, if true, this would be a fantastic subject, a unique fact in anthropology, not known in any other population. Namely, the explanation given here in his book was that the neighboring people of this village, Blit, were willing to give their girls for wives of the Tasaday in order that they would survive. And imagine that people of a higher material standing, like the farmers of Blit, the Manubo tribesmen, would give their women for wives of people living in caves or being of a very poor material standing. This would be the sensation in anthropology. But also, Mr. Hemley comes up with 2 suggestions for clarifying once and for all. Number 1, go and collect DNA samples and find out whether these so-called Tasaday are related to the neighboring Blit and Tiboli tribes. Now, that has been already done, as Hemley describes in his book. One of the linguists who went with him, with the help of Elizalde actually, they collected 50 DNA samples, sent it to the University of Hawaii, and the findings came to no conclusion. Funny, they couldn't find out whether this Tasaday are different people or are related to people I named or people are former Tasaday. Now, if the Tasaday would have been isolated for 10,000 years, or as, for example, Mr. Hemley says, maybe for only 150 years from the people of Blit, This would be a very interesting case for genome researchers, comparable to the research being done with the Icelanders. Now, point number 2, Hemley suggests also a good one. He suggests a team of archaeologists could dig in the middens of the caves. So in the ashes and in the debris of the caves, you can find out how long they were living there. Also, a team of archaeologists volunteered to do that. They were prevented from doing that. So the 2 steps that I agree could be taken to settle the case once for all. DNA and archaeology cannot be done up to now, but still it allows face saving to some of the protagonists, like some linguists and ethnobotanists mainly, and journalists, to stay with the theory that, okay, maybe the Tasaday were not Stone Age, maybe they didn't live all the time in caves, but still they are an autonomous, authentic tribe of their own.